Hi, sorry, I'm having a little trouble sharing my screen. Do let me log in and out. I'll just be back.
Hello. Hello. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, do we need a special hosting screen rights? I thought for speakers it's automatic. Could the admin help us?
Yes,
I've checked with the admin. It's for speakers. It's by default. There is no restriction from the admin end.
right. I've just spoken to Ava. She's just coming back.
Cool. Sounds good. So all she has to do is share her screen from the bottom here.
Hi, hello. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Yeah.
Okay, super. Hi. Sorry, do we have Apar with us? I'm not able to see all the participants.
Please go ahead. Apar will join in a couple of minutes.
All right, super. Hi, hello. I'm Ava, and I work as a researcher at APTI Institute, where we explore issues of access, inclusion, and governance in the intersection of technology and society. I'm your moderator for today's session, and I thank you all for joining us today. Through today's discussion on internet regulation and online harms combat, APTI hopes to bring out perspectives around the digital harms that require coordinated action from social media platforms and the possibilities that platform regulation and self-regulation can offer in this direction. We aim to derive the principles that can guide actions and codes of self-regulation, as well as the roles that stakeholders can play in the facilitation of platform self-regulation, user safety, and business transparency. We hope to speak to distinguished policy and civic individuals in this space who can give us insights around the prominent digital harms of this age, how platforms might translate responsibility into self-regulation, and what might be special to India in dealing with these challenges. On today's panel, we have Mr. Apar Gupta, the Executive Director of the Internet Freedom Foundation, an Indian digital liberties organization that seeks to ensure that technology respects one's fundamental rights. We have Major Vineet Kumar, who is founder and CEO of Cyber Peace Foundation, a civil society organization of cybersecurity that aims to build resilience against cyber harms. And finally, we have Dr. Saryu Natarajan, the founder of APTI Institute. With that, I'd like to pose the first question to Saryu, and if Apar joins us in the meantime, then him as well. How would you describe the global and international setting in which self-regulation of platforms emerge? Additionally, what is the significance of India as a ground for the same within that global setting?
Right. Thank you for that question. And I'm sure Apar and Mr. Vineet will also have a lot to say about this question. I mean, I think that the conversation around self-regulation is one that has been in a nugatory form across different sectors in India, but one that's seen much more emergence, particularly through some of the clauses and provisions around the IT rules, as well as in other sectors as well, through RBI notifications in the financial services sector, etc. So the notion of how corporates and entities can regulate themselves is one that has started gaining traction, particularly in the context of regulating and overseeing the digital economy. I'm going to pause for a
Is that,
second.
let me just interject. Excuse me, whoever is in the
Ex-
admin
Excuse
account,
me,
could you please?
Eva, can you do a slideshow of this your slides? Just click on the.
Yes, just give me a moment.
Don't.
Just a moment. I will make this a little bit bigger for
In
our
the bottom,
speakers.
in the
Understood,
bottom.
understood. Just a moment. Yeah, I am going to open the slides now. This, right?
Yes, this one.
Yeah. All right. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Sari, for that interruption. Please do continue.
Right. No, I was just saying that I think this is a conversation that has been seeing an emergence, not just in India, in across several sectors, but also one that has seen some traction grow globally, particularly jurisdictions like Australia, and I want to say in some contexts in the UK, there have been emergences of self-regulatory codes of conduct. I think that this is something that is in a certain way inevitable, though of course the concerns around the scope and the limits of self-regulation is something we hope we must discuss over the course of today's conversation, and one that must be robustly debated. The push towards self-regulation is interesting and in a certain way inevitable in terms of regulating and moderating the digital economy. And a part of that has to do with the pace of evolution or the pace of change that the digital economy brings with it, and the need for or the difficulties of regulators in sort of playing catch up with it. So of course, and I hope to come to that over the course of the rest of the conversation. In what ways can self-regulation be imagined? What are the limits of it? Where can it actually work and where can it not? Or is there sort of a case to walk away from it entirely? Are all questions we should definitely talk about. But this seems very much a part of a growing trend of regulators wanting to engage with those entities that are building products, services for the digital economy to take on a more active role in regulation in and of itself. So I'll pause here and hand back to you, Ava, but I think that this is something we should unpack a little bit more today.
You're on mute. We can't hear you.
My apologies. I was going to say, Mr. Vineet, if you do have any thoughts or any interjections you would like to share, please feel free.
No, I definitely agree with Dr. Sayu, and I strongly feel, and this is something that we also as an organization have been advocating, that self-regulation is something that should be practiced. And the thing is, technology is evolving at a pace which becomes very difficult for the regulators to catch up. And in this kind of a scenario, it's basically the company, the platforms and all who need to practice. But the question is whether they practice or whether they diligently practice or not is something that we have to kind of check with them, because there are many organizations who kind of say that they practice, but eventually when we find we don't see them practicing self-regulations much. So it should not be a tick mark thing. It should be something that should be done very positively, and ultimately it should be seen how we can impact the society at large, how we can address the issue that the vulnerable population, especially the children, women, and senior citizens have. We need solutions as quick as possible. It should not be something that people keep waiting for solution. If there's a harm that has caused, then it should not be something that it takes time for them to kind of get back with the answers or resolve the particular problem. So I completely agree on the self-regulation part, but what I feel, it has to also be a combination, like self-regulation being one, and the regulators also need to catch up with the way technology is evolving.
Right. Thank you so much for those insights. And perhaps, on the vein of, as Major Vineet has mentioned, it's important to localize these struggles as well and understand the vulnerabilities that are special to particular regulatory territories. And with that, I go on to the next question. And it would be great to hear from all the panelists here on this. What does the Indian policy landscape signal for self-regulation of platforms? Over to you, Sariu.
Thank you. I think that there's, like I mentioned in the first part of the conversation, the Indian regulatory landscape seems to be veering towards exploring the question of self-regulation in much more detail. But before we sort of go into what self-regulation might be and what the opportunities it provides and what the Indian landscape even says, I think the cautions around seeing self-regulation as a substitute for regulation is something we must definitely place on the table. Platforms, and in that sense, any digital business or any business is oriented towards profit and maximization of shareholder value. So the notion of stakeholder value, which creeps in with thinking about self-governance, is not necessarily something that is mandated. It might be desired, but it's not necessarily mandated. And therefore, thinking very carefully about what are the narrow spaces with appropriate guardrails for self-regulation is very, very critical. Now, the Indian landscape does definitely seem to signal a shift towards tackling or sort of looking at self-regulation as a way to tackle several types of challenges that arise with the digital economy. But the most obvious and the most overt one appears to be in the area of regulating content and moderating content and preventing harm that arises as a consequence of harmful material being available online. Now, this, of course, tussles, of course, with the notion of, for example, encryption and encrypted communications, which particularly in interpersonal communications is a significant way of protecting privacy, reducing friction, and also ensuring the ability to have trusted digital interactions, whether in the communication sense or also in the financial services and access sense. So I think that the notion of self-regulation is very intimately tied together with the kinds of protective technologies that are available to enable a safe and inclusive digital economy. So I think that the friction, particularly with self-regulation, arises mostly in this context. So how do you ensure that the aims of law enforcement, the aims of the state, I wouldn't say law enforcement, are to protect its citizens, to ensure healthy, meaningful, reasonable discourse, the opportunity to
Sorry, we seem to be
offer its
losing
citizens
you.
while also offering the opportunity for digital trust. I'll pause here and hand back to you and then figure out my internet system as well.
Okay, all right. Great, thank you, Sarayu. Major Vineet, if you have any perspectives you'd like to share in this direction, it would be most valuable to hear from you.
Right. So, in fact, a lot has been said by Sarayu already. So I'll kind of just add to one thing. Like we talk about different technologies, encryption, again, which is meant to safeguard basically communication, privacy, and all that. But sometimes all of this is also giving birth to certain issues. Like one of the research reports, I'd like to highlight what we have done, what we studied end-to-end platforms. And we studied WhatsApp, we studied Telegram. And what we found out was the predators, the cyber criminals are also kind of misusing the tech. It's abuse of the technology that's happening, where lots of groups were created and entire communications was happening on those platforms, on those particular groups that were there, exchange of child sexual abuse materials, trafficking related inputs were being shared, catalog of women being shared for further trafficking and abuse. So all of that was happening. So we kind of have to see how, in fact, it could be something that the government, industry, academia, civil society, all of us can come together. So self-regulation being one, but then it has to also be kind of supported by the ecosystem around it. And we have to come together. Nobody alone can do it. Right? It's not just the industry or the platforms that they alone can solve the problem through the self-regulation, but it has to be a combination of efforts where all of us, we come together and we kind of work at different levels to kind of make the cyberspace safer for everyone. So that's the point that I wanted to share. And again, happy to kind of discuss it even further when we move ahead.
Thank you so much, Major Vineet. Maybe we could actually jump off into the next question based on what you have just said. What are some of the key on-ground and possibly offline issues with respect to dealing with online harms in the great detail that you have already shared us the kinds of issues that exist when it comes to gender, when it comes to age as well. Would love to hear both about your personal experience and your policy experience around these issues.
Sorry to interrupt. There's a comment. And I'll leave it to you if you guys want to take it now or post the session. It's by Zip10, which says self-regulation has a limited scope, especially when there are large organized groups with political patronage to push their propaganda and false narratives to influence masses for political gains. So, I mean, if you want to take it now or post the discussion, I'll leave it to the panelists. Yeah.
I think, I would say that perhaps we should wait until after our panelists are done sort of sharing their thoughts around some of these questions, and we could take comments and questions afterwards. Does that sound all right?
Great, yes.
That sounds
Yeah,
perfect,
yeah.
Ava. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Right.
Sorry for the interruption, Major Vineet, please go on.
No, that's fine. So basically on the challenges, in fact, the number one challenge that we see on the ground is majority of the cases are not reported. So our helplines are flooded with cases where victims walk up to us and they say that they are not comfortable walking up to a police station reporting about a case because there are social stigmas attached to it, and people would know in the society. They have those myths that if they report to the police, the entire society would come to know, and then issues with marriage and several other stuff. So that's one major thing that we see is a big problem because cases are not getting reported. And if they're not getting reported, that means convictions are not happening. So, and if you talk about the crimes, we have those traditional crimes also happening. But now any traditional crime that we see has a technological component into it. We'll find some or the other way where different platforms are being used. In fact, OTT channels, OTT messaging platform being used, end-to-end encryption being used. A lot of technology is being used, misused some way or the other. And that also gives birth to several kind of crime, like sextortion is something that is really high. It's coming up, and earlier it used to be targeted towards a female or a girl child. Now it is also targeting to all genders. It's not just gender limited, it's targeting all gender. This is something that is kind of coming up almost on a daily basis. Our helplines are flooded with cases like this. The other thing is child sexual abuse material, CSAM. And now CSAM, if we kind of do some random searches, let's not talk about the dark web now, but on the surface web also, if you kind of search and if you check for certain keywords like child sex, for example, you'll find a lot of groups. In fact, there are apps which are there on the stores of Android stores and other places where you'll find there are apps, and these apps kind of have links wherein they can get you access to certain groups where all these information exchange can happen. So that's something that is a cause to worry, and something that we have to see how we can kind of work out on a model to kind of actively find out such applications, such links, such access to the groups where all these information is happening. Now, criminals are also smart. Like what we do, again, group of peacekeepers, we call them as peacekeepers. We kind of constantly are on a lookout for certain groups or particular apps which kind of share these information or disseminate this information. Once we report that app, the app gets taken down, and maybe immediately after, say, half an hour, 45 minutes, we find new apps and group links surfacing. So this is a model that goes on. So it doesn't stop there. Takedown doesn't stop the issues. In fact, people are very active there where you find the new set of links getting surfaced. And that's where we have to be extremely active in terms of finding out the new groups and apps that get created. Then comes the issue of trafficking. Trafficking now is cyber-enabled trafficking. The first connect that in fact happens with a victim is through technology platform. Through, it could be job sites, it could be dating sites, it could be social media. So these are the touch points now where the victim is being targeted. The first connects happen, and further conversation, further conversation, and the trap gets set up to kind of get the victim to a particular point, and then further traffic. Even the rise of instant loan apps. One of the partner organizations whom we closely work with, what we found out that instant loan apps were being used to traffic women. Like during the COVID times, when people had a lot of issues paying their loans and bills on time, what they did was they downloaded this instant loan application, and then after that they got the instant loan, and they were unable to pay things on time. And these creators, what they did was they kind of used several ways and means to get access to their contacts, because they had access to their all the contacts, messages, and everything. And if somebody was unable to pay the loan on time, they were kind of pushed into something that, well, probably they were not comfortable doing. And this was one of the things when one of the victim, actually, she was asked to meet at a particular location, and from there it started. The entire thing started. The victim was further pushed into trafficking, and several things happened. Finally, the victim was recovered. But then I'm saying how things move on from a tech-based platform to the offline world, and vice versa. So it's all happening. Different issues like bullying, stalking. It still continues to grow. By the way, all of these crimes are happening now. One of the study that Cyber Peace Foundation has done it, and it's also, if you search about cyber-enabled traffic and CSAM, it's already on the web. The report is there. What we are now finding is a change where all these incidents are happening from the urban areas, but now we also see a lot of incidents coming from the rural areas. So first-time users of tech. So they are the ones who are also kind of getting exposed to this. They easily believe, like once you get exposed to tech, you kind of believe the messages that you get from a particular, it could be a criminal sending you an offer of an interesting job, and then you click on the thing and then further compromise yourself. So we are seeing that it's not just the urban areas, but a lot of these victims are also coming from rural areas, and these are the ones who are not reporting the cases. So that's basically some of the issues that we see on the ground. I'll also let the other panelists talk and probably contribute later about all the other issues that we are facing.
But thank you so much, Major Vineet. I think what you've been able to do is give a lot of color to what policy and the conversations in the language of policy tend to miss out. So I'm really hoping that this was as insightful for the viewers as it has been for us. I noticed that Apar has been able to join us, so maybe I could field this question to him and move on to the next one as well. What is sorry, Apar, can you hear us? Is everything all right technically on your end? Hello?
Audible?
Hi,
Am I
yes,
audible?
yes. Sorry, it was a little patchy, but I think it'll work itself out. Great. Hi, Apar, and welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm just going to jump you straight into the discussion, really, and just ask you, and we can move on to the other panelists after this. What do you believe to be the nature of relationships that platforms hold with multiple stakeholders, and how does this dynamic change possibly in a self-regulatory environment?
I think I'll need to switch off my video, Eva, to stabilize my connection.
That's all right.
I'm
That's all right.
I'm
That's all
sorry
right.
for this. I've been outside office today, and
Not a
yeah.
problem, Apar. Please go ahead.
So thank you so much for having me. I can assure you this doesn't happen often, but when it does happen, it causes me anxiety. And the first thing I want to bring up is the internet itself. And the reason why I want to bring up, because for me it causes anxiety, but for a lot of communities in India, it causes a lack of safety for them. And this comes from some degree of empirical work, which already exists in the field, and I think contributes to certain interventions which can be designed around ensuring that online spaces and communities have safety mechanisms to ensure and recognize that there's a lot smaller minority of, for instance, women from India who are participating online. In fact, Oxfam's recent inequality report, which has come out only this week, highlights that only it's the I think the proportion which is illustrated by them is that for every one woman who has ever accessed the internet, there are 3 Indian men who have accessed it. And I think by itself, this should lead to certain regulatorism which may put to question. For instance, I think so when we witnessed the first waves of content moderation for social media platforms, it was premised on what was called as community policing. And here it becomes then important to ask ourselves, who is the community? Is that only a man itself, and by itself, that kind of gender bias will then reflect in what is perceived as being content which is safe or not unsafe for another person by itself. So I think access, especially which is gendered in India, which is not including several communities to the same extent, becomes an important becomes an important and significant factor in self-regulatory mechanisms of how online spaces can be made safe. I'll stop here for a minute and pause here, and and if there are any further questions, I can come on like the individual stands which are there.
Thank you so much, Apar. I would like to, I guess, move it to Sariu and understand from your perspective, given also your past work on platform regulation. I would love to hear your perspectives around these, around what might look like the stakeholder engagement and relationship when it comes to self-regulation of social media platforms.
Right. Yes. So I mean, I'd like to build on the points Apar and Major Vineet have made around sort of different kinds of relationships. I think it was very interesting to hear the perspectives around sort of the offline manifestations of the harm, and therefore the needs of like the different types of relationships that need to exist. But in the context of self-regulation, while sort of there has been some debate around the nature of engagement with the policymaker, as well as the nature of engagement with different institutions such as law enforcement agencies. Much less is said about what self-regulatory environments do for the relationships platforms have with themselves and their products and services. Now, one of the key principles, and this is of course, for a moment, setting aside all the concerns and the limitations and the challenges of thinking of self-regulation in the broadest swath, is the question of like products become the most powerful way in order to ensure protection and safety. And product features and aspects of the product and how things are governed around it can become actually a powerful mechanism by which user safety can be ensured. Now, of course, that is not to say that's either a silver bullet solution or a complete one in any which way. But product features such as difficulties in sending bulk messages, friction in terms of communication, can all have significant impacts on user safety. That is not to say that you can walk away from, for example, thinking about resilience at the community level, whether it's with engagement through civil society, through capacity in the police sense, or more broadly speaking, regulation in and of itself. But the relationship that companies and platforms can have with products to enhance features, including agency, for example, to allow you to block, to sort of limit your exposure, are all features. Now, of course, none of this answers the question of capacity to use these features and engage with digital systems, which, as we know, and Apar alluded to it, and Major Vineet said it as well, that there's humongous evidence that the most marginalized, the most disadvantaged when it comes to using digital systems in any manner of speaking. But having said that, thinking more deeply about the ways in which product features themselves, particularly when sort of buttressed with education at the community level, as well as meaningful grievance redressal mechanisms, can actually sort of enhance user safety and a more safe and accessible and vibrant internet. I'll pause here and hand back to you, Ava.
Thank you so much, Sariu. I would like to, I suppose, follow up on a question that you have in some ways sort of posed here, and it comes back to something you have mentioned earlier in terms of guardrails around self-regulation. And this is a question, of course, I'd like to open to everyone as well. Given that we're debating the value of self-regulation in today's world, it might be useful to understand what might inform the principles or the guiding ethos of something like self-regulation, and particularly with respect to India. And beyond that, then that to understand what is it that can be self-regulated when it comes to encrypted platforms or non-encrypted public forumized platforms. What is it that should be in the domain of the platform to have some level of regulation under, what shouldn't be there. Would love to understand everyone's views on this question as it brings us to the heart of the issue, really. And maybe I could go to Apar first. Have you say a few words on this?
Thanks.
I'm so sorry, Apar. Your internet does seem to be patching out quite a bit.
For duration. So hello, I'm audible now.
Hi, Apar. Yes, yes. I'm hoping we don't face too many issues with the internet. Do you mind just saying one sentence and then we can just assess?
Yeah, so am I audible now? I'm sorry, this is
Yes,
so
this is much better.
inconvenient
This is
question.
this is much better. This is much better. Please continue.
Okay, okay. So I think one of the core issues which has been identified with what is usually in practice, variances which are counted for Apple laws in different countries is not consistent. What I mean by this, and this is a lot of verbiage, is that it enforces its policies very differently in the United States and the rest of the world. And I think here two core areas have been highlighted by the Hogan papers as well as by Alex Demos. I think the first issue is the resource spend. So if you're saying you're a global platform and the rest of the world accounts for, let's say, about 80% of your users, isn't the resource spend in content moderation matching that in a sense, right? Local language classifiers, if they are absent. I know that companies have improved since these disclosures were made, but I think that kind of global thinking when you're rolling out a global product is very much necessary. The second thing, which I think is important, is that each country does not have the rule of law framework such as the United States. We need to account for it honestly and pragmatically. And I think there should be some institutional mechanisms in which the policy team, which deals with much more contentious topics with any kind of local government, is completely insulated and separated as a functional unit from the content moderation actually enforced by the platform. I think these are two tangible interventions, more money, as well as organizational autonomy for the content moderation to be implemented, which will be of benefit to end users.
Thank you, Apar. Major Vineet, could I get you in on this question as well?
Yeah, I think what I feel is basically when you talk about India, what we feel is kind of missing out is something like a trust and safety board that probably we need here, wherein all such cases, when it comes to content moderation or when it comes to issues of the victims and all that, I mean, there should be a board to kind of address the issues, which we currently don't have it. There's some thing that's being worked out, and in fact, the IT rules which got amended also, and previously as well, when IT rules were launched, it had a kind of a position of the grievance officer, which every companies or every platform needs to have. But I think it's again a tick mark. What we have seen on the ground, it's not working much. Grievance officers are there, but then I don't feel that the grievance are being handled properly. It's just like a post office where all the requests go, whether it's being addressed, whether the issues are being resolved and all that is something that needs further clarity, and also a proper environment needs to be formed. Structure needs to be formed where things are properly done, and even the victim has an access to the status of the grievance, and it is clearly visible to everyone. So that is what I feel. And a trust and safety board, it is a huge success in other countries we have seen, but in India it's missing. It could be a trust and safety board the South Asia level, maybe if not India, platform can think of coming together and forming a board at the South Asia level. So something of this kind is what I would like to kind of suggest. Also, working with the law enforcement, we have seen a major problem. Like if a crime happens from some other country, if a crime happens from some other nation other than the Indian boundary, it takes on an average around a year's time. It used to be 6 months earlier, but now it's taking more than a year for the law enforcement to get data from a foreign land, from a foreign territory. So that is a major problem. By the time the data comes to us, by the time data travels back through the channel, it is very late. And we are talking here about giving relief to the victims on the ground, giving relief to the vulnerable population on the ground. And imagine if the data comes after a year, it is of no use. It's good when it comes to child, like cases related to child, everybody is something very responsive. Platforms are responsive, and countries are responsive. But the major problem happens when it is something dealing with above 18 and with the adults, and issues are happening, increasing on a daily basis. Imagine law enforcement is helpless at times. So a proper architecture, when you talk about in the relationship between regulator, platforms, and other entities, different stakeholders. So there should be a kind of a format where all of us kind of engage and think of kind of giving the relief to the victims on the ground, giving relief to the people on the ground.
Thank you so much, Major Vineet. I wonder, Sarayu, if you have any, if I could hear your thoughts on what Major Vineet has said about institutions and architectures becoming central to the self-regulation platform. Do you believe that as it currently stands, the Indian landscape is equipped, or what might have to be undertaken to reach that kind of consciousness for self-regulation?
Right. I think there are two parts to this discussion. One, of course, is what Major Vineet said, and I think Apar also alluded to, which is institutional resilience and capacities, and also sort of enabling legal frameworks such as around data sharing, etc. As relevant. And there are some cautions around it, but I think thinking about resilience upfront is critical. This goes to a variety of things, ranging from having local institutions, local sort of law enforcement agencies have a better sense of online offline connects, much more sensitization around harms. So all of these are definitely one sort of pillar upon which to build it. But I think this, the second part of what I'd like to say refers to something Apar said, and I think Major Vineet also referred to, is recentering the state back in the debates around self-governance. And I think that in our conversation around, and the opportunities that self-regulation might provide, whether it's through a broader ecosystem collaboration, engagement with civil society, or even sort of looking more deeply at product features and setting up industry standards, we should never step away from the fact that the state is the ultimate regulator and arbiter of very much of what happens in society, and definitely in a constitutional democracy such as ourselves. Which means that there are a couple of things to think about as to what the state must or ought to do or should be concerned about. One, of course, is, and I think Apar said it as well, which is thinking more deeply about the frameworks and guardrails around any self-regulatory space. To think about it without the state setting up the initial frameworks and guardrails is dangerous and can end up being self-serving, because let's be clear that platforms and businesses in that sense are focused on shareholder value, and therefore the aim of regulation or self-regulation for them is essentially to maximize that value. I think the second thing is that, in self-regulatory frameworks, the redress through appeal to the state must remain. And in what form or fashion that happens, I think is definitely something that must be discussed in a context to context. But, remaining or sort of being the fail-safe for citizens for redressal is very critical. That's a critical state function, and therefore must continue regardless of the type of framework we operate in. I think the third, of course, and this is a deeper conversation, I suppose, that goes beyond self-regulation and goes to the heart of, how India particularly is regulating its digital economy, is that the limits and checks and balances with respect to the state also need to be understood. So in what ways is state power, and I think Apar mentioned it in terms of sort of separating the function of content moderation with the function of sort of engaging with the state, but the checks and balances on state power, state overreach through a legislative framework, even in some instances, is something that must be understood. That is not to say that the state, the state has a legitimate interest, quite clearly, in ensuring a safe, secure internet, because, quite deeply, there are both sort of normative concerns around making sure that the internet is a safe space, but also a very instrumental one, because India wants to be a digital economy. With the taking over of the G20 presidency, digital is very much firmly on the agenda. So questions like a safe, secure internet are definitely important to consider, and regulating it is definitely a legitimate aim of the state, but bounding that in a way that is in accordance with our principles of constitutional democracy is also a necessity. The upshot of all of this is that in conversations around self-regulation, which promise something, around ensuring, the safety and security of our digital economy, we must not forget that the state is quite critical to a lot of these debates and continue to sort of interrogate what role the state must play. I'll pause here and hand back to you, Ava.
Thank you, Saryu. I think your sort of detailed exposition around the role of the state naturally leads us into the last question. And since you have already in some way set the ground for the other speakers, I wonder, Apar, if you have any thoughts on what has been said in terms of this question, and then Major Vineet. And I believe after that we can wrap up with comments or questions. But yeah, please do go ahead.
I'm just checking for my my audio coming through first. Okay, thanks.
It's great. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think just continuing with what I think may be tangible, and given that this is a forum where some decision makers may be turning in as well, I think what may further deepen trust in self-regulatory practices is transparency about it. And I think the United Nations is also working around a regulatory framework where mandated transparency requirements by platforms by itself is one core element around it. And I think that we should look at what can be that nature of transparency. I think to some extent that has been adopted under the IT rules, but it needs to be much more meaningful. And the second thing is that the access for researchers by itself, not only for government, needs to be protected and needs to be deepened. Because quite often the capacity and the resources within public offices may not match that within academic institutions itself over a longer period of time to study each individual platform, which is its own ecology, right? And which has its own self-regulatory systems which evolve over a period of time and pass through that data. And in fact, if we see, big tech has been very resistant to that in the past. I think this is something which is very, very necessary. The final piece of tangible action, I think so, which is also needed is that as more and more AI systems rather than human-based content moderation decisions are taken to implement online safety, there needs to be algorithmic transparency and audit-based frameworks which are not only open to the government but are open to the public. The end Indian internet user who is using social media platforms very, very widely needs to know why certain content is being displayed to them, why certain content is not being displayed to them, why certain content is being taken down, etc. I think transparency is one core pillar where there's incredible agreement, but the specificities still need to be worked out, and its institutional mechanism holds a lot of promise.
Thank you, Apar. Major Vineet, would you like to end our round of moderating questions with any remarks?
Well, I would say while we come here together to discuss, I'm sure we have discussed about several things, the role of regulator, the role of platforms, the role of civil society. What I feel in the end is everybody, I mean, if we talk about safety, security, it's not one entity alone, and it has to be a collaborative approach, a multi-stakeholder approach, where all of us need to come together. And this is something that everybody has to contribute to the subject and make sure that the safe is safer for netizens, for first-time users, because what I genuinely feel is we need to do something strongly for those who are joining the bus, who are joining the internet space, who are joining the movement, and they need to get that assurance that the safe is safer for them. And safe is not vulnerable, and safe is not something that is something that would target them. So we have to instill that confidence in the users that the safe is safer and something that is seen on a positive side rather than negative. So because people get scared on the ground. That's what we have seen with our set of interaction when we have gone, if something has happened to a set of people in a particular village. And I am mentioning about this because now we're focusing a lot on the rural areas. And that's when we see that people get scared and they say that we'd like to stay away from these platforms, away from the technology. And then that's where we say that things are quite positive, things are good. However, there are some safe practices that you need to take. And these capacity building sessions, the settings that, in fact, Dr. Saryu also mentioned, the applications also need to be safer. with a set of new features like what we recommended earlier when we had done the report on end-to-end platform. We had suggested that we should have a report CSAM as an option. When you talk about reporting should be a combination of AI as well as human-based moderators who should be there to kind of see the kind of content that is coming, because you might miss, algorithms might miss something important. So that is what there are certain changes that the platform also need to do. They also need to kind of make those relevant changes. And again, everybody, even the regulators in fact are also doing quite a lot now with the IT rules getting amended. We are expecting the cybersecurity strategy also to come soon, the Indian cybersecurity strategy. The data protection, the digital data protection bill has also been, the draft bill is already shared. So hopefully the bill will become an act, and that is what something that we are all aiming, that we have the right kind of regulations in place. We have capacity building around the end users who are there, so that they are aware about their rights, they are aware about their responsibility, they are resilient enough if something goes wrong, they are resilient enough to report about a case, to reach out to enforcement agencies, to reach out to the regulators about an issue, and overall the platforms who need to be more responsible enough, because it's not just they should not feel that they are just the intermediaries, but they also have a great role to play. So these are certain inputs from my side. So thank you so much, Ava, and all the panelists for having me here.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Major Vineet. And with that, we're done with our questions. We have a couple of minutes left. I think we have one comment that if any of the panelists would like to address, we could move to that, and then let's see how it goes from there. Should I read out this comment? Is that, yeah? Siddan Zahir has expressed, self-regulation has a limited scope, especially when there are large organized groups with political patronage to push their propaganda and false narrative to influence masses for political gains. I wonder if anyone would like to engage with this extremely sort of rife question. Sari, would you like to take the lead on this one?
I could, and I'm going to try. I think it's got many layers to it for sure. I do think, regardless of the realities of like socio-political realities and patterns of politics, self-regulation is limited in scope. Let's be clear about that. I think there are opportunities it provides, particularly in areas where digital systems and technologies and manners of harm are changing very rapidly. Regardless of what kind of socio-political scenario we are in, self-regulation is limited in its applicability, and should be seen as such. And the aim of having a discussion about self-regulation should be to focus on, how to ensure that there are appropriate guardrails, how to ensure that there are fail-safe mechanisms around self-regulatory systems, and continuing to have the conversation about user safety, etc. But it cannot be said enough, but self-regulation is limited in scope.
Thank you very much, Sarayu. I will say, since we are running extremely short of time, I think we should just move on to concluding the session. And I would like to first and foremost thank all the panelists here today. This has been extremely valuable. A couple of takeaways I'd like to highlight. Perhaps one is that clearly there is an offline component to every online harm and vice versa. And you cannot have that conversation without taking appropriate note of both in the proportions that they deserve in any specific context. Another perhaps is that the user is the center for self-regulation. And it's great that both Apar and Major Vineet were able to highlight the specificities that make Indians vulnerable, whether it's hard infrastructures of access or social infrastructures of gender. And finally, as Sarayu has noted, there is extremely wide sort of potential given the different kinds of regulating interests, but it has to be done as a fine balancing act. With that, I will end the session, and I'd like to thank everyone once again. This has been extremely, extremely insightful. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Major Vineet. Thank you, Apar. Thanks, Ava, for the wonderful moderation.
You're welcome.
Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.